I had always dreamed of having a quiet place away from the chaos of the city, somewhere I could disappear to on the weekends, work with my hands, and feel like life slowed down for a while. That dream came true a few months ago when I found a rundown little cabin by a lake 2 hours from where I lived. It wasn't much to look at, honestly. The wood was faded, the roof sagged in places, and the porch looked like it might collapse if you stepped too hard. But it had character. It had potential. And most importantly, it had a view of the lake that looked like something straight out of a postcard. The first time I stood on that porch and watched the sun go down over the water, I knew this was where I wanted to spend my time. I bought the cabin as is, with plans to fix it up myself, turning it into a peaceful little retreat. When I pulled up that first weekend with my truck full of tools, lumber, paint, and everything else I thought I might need, I felt like a kid on Christmas morning. The driveway was little more than a gravel path that wound between tall pines and oaks, crunching under my tires as I crept closer to the cabin. The air smelled fresh, like damp earth and pine needles, a welcome change from the exhaust fumes and hot asphalt I'd been living around for years. The cabin itself was quiet, no signs of anyone else around, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I got out of the truck, stretched my legs, and took in the silence for a minute before getting to work. I spent that whole morning clearing out the inside of the cabin. Whoever owned it before me had left behind a lot of junk. Old furniture, broken appliances, boxes of random odds and ends that probably hadn't been touched in years. I hauled everything outside into a big pile, planning to sort it later. It was hard work, but it felt good. Sweat on my brow, sawdust in the air, the kind of labor that made you feel like you'd really accomplished something. By the afternoon, the inside of the cabin was empty except for the bare necessities. The old wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen sink, and the wooden beams overhead that gave the place its rustic charm. I stood there with my hands on my hips, smiling to myself. This was the start of something good. But then, just as I was about to start tearing up the old flooring, I heard something outside, the crunch of gravel under tires, more than one vehicle. I stepped outside, squinting against the sunlight, and saw 2 white SUVs rolling up the driveway. Both had the words HOA Security printed on the side in bold black letters. My first thought was confusion. HOA? I hadn't seen anything about a homeowners association in the paperwork when I bought this place. This was supposed to be an unrestricted property. No rules, no dues, no board breathing down my neck telling me what color I could paint my own house. The SUVs stopped in front of the cabin and 2 men got out. They were both dressed in dark uniforms with badges on their chests, wearing utility belts with radios and what looked like stun guns. Not police, but definitely trying to look official. One of them was a tall, broad guy with a buzz cut and sunglasses, while the other was shorter, stockier, and had a clipboard in his hand. "Can I help you?" I asked, stepping down from the porch. The tall one spoke first. "Sir, you're trespassing. This property is part of Lakewood Estates, a private HOA community. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I almost laughed. "Trespassing? This is my property. I just bought it a few weeks ago. I've got the deed and everything." The shorter guy flipped through his clipboard, shaking his head. "No, sir. According to our records, this cabin has been abandoned for years and is under the jurisdiction of the HOA. If you don't leave voluntarily, we'll have to contact the sheriff and have you removed." Now I wasn't laughing. My chest tightened, and I felt that stubborn anger rising up in me. I knew for a fact this place was mine. I'd signed the papers myself, wired the money, and even had the title transferred into my name. There was no way these guys were just going to show up and bully me off my own land. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I don't know what kind of records you have, but this cabin isn't abandoned anymore. I bought it legally, and I have every right to be here. You can call whoever you want, sheriff, mayor, governor, but I'm not going anywhere." The tall one took a step closer, his sunglasses reflecting my face back at me. "Sir, I'm not going to argue with you. You need to pack up and leave before this becomes a bigger problem." Something in the way he said that made my blood boil. Bigger problem? Like what? They'd find me? Arrest me? I wasn't about to back down, not on day one of turning this place into the cabin I'd always wanted. I told them flat out that I wasn't leaving, that I had proof of ownership, and that if they wanted me off the property, they'd better come back with a court order. They didn't like that answer. The shorter guy muttered something under his breath, scribbled on his clipboard, and the tall one said they'd be back with enforcement before they both got into their SUVs and drove off, kicking up dust down my driveway. For a few minutes, I just stood there, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. I'd been on the property less than a day and was already being threatened with removal by some self-appointed HOA guards. I didn't know if they were bluffing, if they really had any legal authority, or if this was some kind of scam to intimidate people into paying dues for a neighborhood they weren't even part of. Either way, I knew one thing. I wasn't going to be bullied. This cabin was mine, and I wasn't about to let anyone tell me otherwise. I went back inside, locked the door, and decided I'd better find every single piece of paperwork I had on this property. Deed, title, sale agreement, tax documents, everything. If this was going to turn into a fight, I was going to be ready. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made me sit up and look out the window, half expecting those SUVs to come back with a sheriff or more guards. The wind howled through the trees, and every creak of the old cabin reminded me just how isolated this place really was. But that isolation was also what I loved about it. No neighbors right on top of me, no city noise, just me and the lake. By morning, I was even more determined not to give this place up. I made myself some strong coffee on the wood stove, sat out on the porch, and watched the mist rise off the water. That calm view helped settle my nerves. This was mine. I had paid for it. No HOA could just show up and throw me off my own land. After breakfast, I spread all my paperwork out on the kitchen counter like a battle plan. Deed, property survey, bill of sale, everything clearly showed my name on it. I even called the county recorder's office to double check, and they confirmed the property was legally mine. No HOA lien, no restrictions, nothing on the books. That gave me a little confidence boost, but I still had a bad feeling those guys weren't going to let this go. Around noon, I heard it again. The crunch of tires on gravel, only this time there were more of them. I stepped outside and saw not 2, but 4 SUVs pulling up the driveway. My stomach tightened. This time, it wasn't just the 2 guards from yesterday. They had backup. 2 more guys in matching uniforms, plus a woman in business clothes who looked like she meant business. She had a tablet in her hand and walked with that clipped, authoritative stride of someone used to being in charge. "Morning," I called out, trying to sound casual, even though I could feel my heart rate kicking up. She didn't smile. "Sir, we need to speak with you about your continued trespassing on HOA property." I held up the deed I'd grabbed from the counter. "Not trespassing. This is my property, and I have proof. Right here." She barely glanced at the paper before shaking her head. "Our records indicate that this parcel is part of Lakewood Estates common property. It has been maintained by the HOA for over a decade, and per our bylaws, you cannot occupy it without approval. You're in violation of several community rules, including unauthorized renovations." "Unauthorized renovations?" I said, laughing in disbelief. "Lady, I'm cleaning out my own cabin. And your records are wrong. I bought this place legally. If you think otherwise, take it to court. Until then, you have no right to be here telling me what I can and can't do." The tall guard from yesterday stepped forward, puffing up like he was ready for a fight. "You've been warned. If you don't vacate voluntarily, we will issue fines and start legal proceedings." "Good," I shot back. "Issue whatever you want. I'll see you in court. But until then, you're trespassing on my property. So unless you have a sheriff with you and a court order, you need to leave." The woman's jaw tightened, clearly not used to being talked to that way. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. We are authorized to take control of abandoned properties in the community, and you are interfering with that process." "Then I suggest you update your records," I said, crossing my arms, "because this property isn't abandoned anymore." They all just stood there for a moment, like they didn't quite know what to do with someone who wasn't rolling over and doing what they said. Finally, the woman sighed, tapped something on her tablet and said, "This isn't over. You'll be hearing from our attorney." Then she turned and walked back to her SUV, the others following. But before they left, the tall guard leaned in close enough that I could smell his aftershave. "You'd better watch yourself out here. Things can get complicated." I didn't flinch, just stared him down until he turned away and got back in the vehicle. The SUVs rolled out one by one, leaving me standing in the driveway with my fists clenched. That afternoon, I drove into town and stopped by the sheriff's office. If they were going to threaten me with legal action or worse, I wanted the local authorities on my side. I asked to speak with the sheriff, and after waiting a while, a big, weathered man in a brown uniform came out to greet me. I explained everything, how I bought the cabin, how the HOA had shown up twice claiming I was trespassing, and how they'd threatened me. The sheriff listened, nodded a few times, and finally said, "Far as I know, that property isn't part of Lakewood Estates. But HOAs around here can be pushy. They think they run the whole lake." "That's what I figured," I said. "So what happens if they come back and try to force me off my own property?" The sheriff leaned back in his chair and gave me a slow look. "They can't legally remove you without a court order. If they try, call us, but I'd keep my paperwork handy and maybe install some cameras. Folks like that, they don't always play fair." That last part didn't sit well with me. Cameras? Why would I need cameras unless he knew something I didn't? But I took his advice seriously. On the way back, I stopped at a hardware store and bought a couple of motion-activated cameras, the kind that send alerts to your phone. If the HOA was planning to mess with me, I wanted evidence. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the lake. I installed the cameras on the porch and driveway before heading inside for the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The HOA clearly thought they had some kind of claim to my property, and they weren't going to back off quietly. As I sat at the kitchen table, looking at my deed again, I felt a mix of anger and determination. They wanted a fight? Fine. I wasn't about to let a bunch of wannabe cops and a clipboard-toting bureaucrat scare me out of the one place I'd wanted my whole life. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a truck idling outside. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my boots, threw on a jacket, and rushed out the door. Sure enough, parked right at the edge of my driveway was a pickup truck with Lakewood Estates Maintenance stenciled on the door. Two men in reflective vests were unloading something from the back, bright orange signs. "What are you doing?" I shouted, storming toward them. One of the men glanced at me, unfazed. "Posting violation notices. This property is under HOA enforcement." "Like hell it is," I snapped. "You're trespassing. Get off my land." He just shrugged, walked to the tree line, and hammered one of the signs into the ground. I stormed over and ripped it right back out. The guy gave me a smirk like he'd been expecting that and said, "Suit yourself, but every day you stay here, the fines are going to go up. We'll tow that truck next." I laughed bitterly. "Good luck with that." They finished sticking two more signs in the ground, one by the driveway, another right in front of the cabin, then climbed back in the truck and drove off, leaving me standing there with my blood boiling. The signs were basically giant warnings: trespassing, HOA enforcement in effect, property under dispute. It was like they were trying to humiliate me, make me look like some squatter who didn't belong. I yanked the other two signs out, tossed them into the bed of my own truck, and went inside to cool down. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was intimidation, plain and simple. And the fact they thought they could just come onto my land and plant signs made it clear they weren't going to stop. Over the next week, things got worse. Every morning, I'd find new notices taped to my cabin door, fines for illegal occupancy, citations for unapproved construction, warnings that my account was past due. I didn't even have an account with them, but that didn't stop them from adding late fees, penalties, and threats of legal action. Then came the night visits. My cameras caught them first, headlights creeping up my driveway at 2 a.m, stopping just long enough for someone to toss something onto my porch before driving off. The next morning, I'd find garbage bags full of leaves, dead fish, even an old tire left in front of my door. It was childish, but it was clearly meant to rattle me. I saved every clip from the cameras and started a folder on my laptop labeled Evidence. If this turned into a court battle, I wanted every single incident documented. After 2 weeks of this, I decided to take the fight back to them. I drove down to the HOA office, a fancy little building at the entrance to Lakewood Estates with manicured hedges and a flagpole out front. Inside, it smelled like fresh carpet and lemon cleaner. A receptionist with a pasted-on smile looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, dropping a stack of violation notices on the counter with a loud thump. "You can tell whoever's in charge that if their goons set foot on my property again, I'll have them arrested for trespassing." Her smile didn't falter, but I could see her eyes narrow just a little. "Sir, if you have a dispute with the HOA, you'll need to submit a formal petition." "I don't need to submit anything," I cut in. "I own that property. I've got the deed, the tax records, and the sheriff himself told me you don't have jurisdiction. So unless you want me to file harassment charges, you'll leave me the hell alone." That got her attention. She picked up the stack of notices, glanced at them, then said, "One moment," and disappeared into a back office. A few minutes later, the same woman who'd shown up at my cabin the second day walked out, tablet in hand, looking just as composed and businesslike as before. "Mr." She checked her tablet. "Turner, we've received notice of your objections. But you must understand, the HOA has maintained that parcel for years. We have financial interest in its upkeep." "Financial interest doesn't mean ownership," I shot back. "And even if you think you have a claim, that's for a judge to decide, not you." She tilted her head, clearly not used to someone talking back to her like this. "Very well. But be advised, while this is being resolved, we will continue to issue fines." "Go ahead," I said with a smirk. "Every one of those fines is going straight into my evidence folder. And when I countersue for harassment, it's going to look real bad for you." For the first time, I saw her composure slip. Just a flicker of annoyance, but it was enough to tell me I'd landed a hit. She turned on her heel and went back to her office without another word. That night, I got my first taste of real retaliation. Sometime after midnight, the cameras picked up movement near my truck. By the time I got outside, whoever it was had already taken off, but they'd slashed my tires and keyed the side of the door. I stood there in the cold night air, staring at the damage, my hands balled into fists. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was criminal, and it was personal. The next morning, I took the footage to the sheriff. He watched it, nodded, and said, "Yep, that's one of the HOA's security guys." "I know him. So what are you going to do about it?" I demanded. He sighed. "I can file a report, but unless we catch him in the act, it's hard to prove." "You might want to think about getting a lawyer." I left the sheriff's office more angry than I'd been since this whole thing started. "A lawyer might be able to help me fight in court. But what about the here and now? What about protecting myself and my property?" When I got back to the cabin, I started making real preparations. I put up more cameras, hidden ones this time, around the property. I reinforced the locks on the doors and windows, and I started keeping my shotgun loaded and within arm's reach. I didn't want trouble, but if they were going to escalate to vandalism, I wasn't going to sit back and wait for them to take it further. By the end of that week, I felt like I was living in a siege. Every day, new notices. Every night, someone messing with my property. But I wasn't leaving. If anything, every attack just made me more stubborn. This was my cabin, my land, my dream, and they were going to have to drag me out kicking and screaming before I gave it up. By the fourth weekend, I had started to get used to the rhythm of harassment, the early morning signs, the taped notices, the sound of vehicles creeping up my driveway at night. I was tired, sure, but I wasn't scared anymore. If anything, I was just angry. Angry that they thought they could wear me down, angry that they treated me like some squatter who didn't belong on my own land. That anger kept me going. It pushed me to wake up every day and keep renovating, keep improving the cabin, keep proving to myself that I wasn't going anywhere. But then came the day they decided to cross the line completely. It was early Saturday morning, when I heard the sound of heavy engines outside. Not just one, several. I looked out the window and saw a convoy coming up my driveway. 2 SUVs, a flatbed tow truck, and what looked like a moving truck. My heart started pounding. This wasn't another round of warning signs. This looked like an eviction. I grabbed my phone and started recording before I even opened the door. By the time I stepped outside, there were 6 uniformed guards in my yard, plus the same clipboard-wielding woman from before. She stood there with her arms folded, looking like she was about to take possession of the place right then and there. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. She didn't flinch. "Mr. Turner, this is your final notice. You are in violation of HOA regulations and have refused to vacate. Per board approval, we are authorized to remove unauthorized property and secure the premises." I laughed. An ugly, bitter laugh that came from somewhere deep inside. "Board approval? Lady, you don't own this property. You can't secure anything here. If you try to touch my truck or my cabin, I will call the sheriff and I will have every single one of you arrested for trespassing." One of the guards stepped forward, clearly trying to intimidate me. "Sir, stand aside. We don't want this to get physical." I raised my phone higher, making sure the camera caught everything. "You take one more step toward my cabin, and this video goes straight to the sheriff, the county judge, and every news outlet that will listen. I have every piece of paperwork showing this is my land. If you try to remove anything from here, you're committing theft." That made them hesitate. I could see it in the way the guard froze mid-step, the way the woman's jaw tightened. She tried to recover quickly, pulling out her tablet. "Mr. Turner, you leave us no choice but to escalate this matter legally." "Good," I said, my voice like steel. "Take it to court. I dare you. Because when you do, I'm going to countersue for harassment, vandalism, and trespassing. And thanks to these cameras, I have all the evidence I need." I gestured toward the porch where one of my motion-activated cameras was aimed right at them. I could almost see the moment she realized they had been caught on tape every single time they'd set foot on my property. She muttered something under her breath, turned to the guards, and said, "Stand down. We're leaving." But before they could leave, the tow truck driver, clearly frustrated that he'd driven all the way out there for nothing, shouted, "This ain't over," and revved his engine before backing out of the driveway. The guards followed, but not before giving me some pretty nasty looks. Once they were gone, I went back inside and sat down hard on one of the kitchen chairs, still shaking from the adrenaline. I knew this wasn't the end, but it felt like a small victory. I had stood my ground, and they had backed off. That afternoon, I called a lawyer, a property rights attorney, recommended by a friend in town. I sent him scans of every document, every violation notice, and every video clip I had saved. He called me back later that night and said, "You've got a strong case. If they keep this up, we can hit them with a restraining order and damages. They have no legal standing." That gave me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in weeks. Finally, I wasn't just playing defense, I was preparing to go on the offensive. But the HOA didn't take defeat lightly. A few days later, I found my driveway blocked by a massive pile of gravel, dumped right where my truck usually sat. There was no way that was an accident. It took me 3 hours with a shovel to clear enough space to get out. I reported it to the sheriff, who just shook his head and said, "I'll add it to the report." That night, I made a decision. Enough was enough. If they wanted to play dirty, I could play smart. I invested in better security, floodlights with motion sensors, a trail cam deep in the tree line, and even a small drone that I could use to monitor the property. If they so much as set foot near my cabin again, I would have them on video from multiple angles. The following weekend, my cameras caught something I'd been half expecting. 2 of the guards sneaking onto the property at night with bolt cutters, clearly trying to get close to my shed. This time, I didn't just save the footage. I called the sheriff right then and there. By some miracle, a deputy was nearby and arrived within 15 minutes. The guards were still on my property when the deputy pulled up, lights flashing. I stood on the porch, shotgun in hand but pointed safely down, and watched as the deputy confronted them. "You 2 are trespassing," the deputy said flatly. "Drop the cutters, hands where I can see them." The look on their faces was priceless. They tried to argue, claiming they were performing HOA duties, but the deputy wasn't buying it. He cuffed them right there and hauled them off. When the tow truck came later to pick up their SUVs, I stood in the driveway with my arms crossed, feeling that first real surge of victory. For weeks, they'd been trying to push me out, scare me off, make me bend. But now they were the ones being hauled away for breaking the law. That night, I finally slept peacefully for the first time in a month. But I also knew this fight wasn't over yet. The HOA still had money, lawyers, and influence, and they weren't just going to walk away quietly. If anything, I figured they'd double down, and when they did, I'd be ready. The morning after the 2 guards were arrested, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since this nightmare started, it felt like the tide was finally turning. I spent the whole morning gathering everything I had, every video clip, every violation notice, every photo of the vandalism, even screenshots of the emails they'd sent threatening me with fines. By the time my lawyer called later that day, I had a mountain of evidence organized and ready. "Good," he said over the phone after I explained the arrests. "This changes everything. We can now file for a restraining order against the HOA and its security contractor. Once that's in place, they won't be able to step foot on your property without risking jail time." Within 48 hours, he had the paperwork filed with the county court. The judge signed off on a temporary restraining order almost immediately, citing the recent trespassing and vandalism as justification. When I got the call, I practically shouted with relief. But my lawyer wasn't done. "We should also consider filing a civil suit," he said. "Harassment, emotional distress, property damage, the works. The HOA has been operating outside its authority, and it's time to hold them accountable." I didn't even hesitate. "Do it!" The lawsuit was filed the following week, and that's when things really started to heat up. The HOA lawyer tried to stonewall us at first, claiming they had jurisdiction over the property based on some old plat map from decades ago. But when we subpoenaed their records, we discovered something shocking. Not only had they been wrong about the property boundaries, they had been knowingly assessing fees on parcels they didn't even own for years. It was a money grab, plain and simple, and I wasn't the only one they had been targeting. My lawyer suggested we go public, so I did. I shared my story, with video proof, on social media and in a local news interview. The footage of the guards being arrested spread like wildfire, and before long, other property owners started coming forward with their own complaints about the HOA. Some had been bullied into paying thousands in bogus fees. Others had been threatened with foreclosure if they didn't comply with arbitrary rules. By the time we got to court, the case had turned into more than just me versus the HOA. It had become a spotlight on their corruption. The courtroom was packed the day the hearing began. Reporters were there, neighbors were there, and even the county commissioner showed up to see what was going on. When it was my turn to testify, I told the judge everything, how I'd bought the cabin legally, how the HOA had shown up threatening me, how they vandalized my property and tried to force me out. My lawyer played the security footage for the court, showing the guards planting signs, dumping trash, slashing my tires, and finally getting caught with bolt cutters. The HOA lawyer tried to argue that the guards were enforcing community standards, but the judge wasn't buying it. He kept asking the same question. "Where is the legal deed showing this property is part of your HOA?" They didn't have one. In the end, the judge's ruling was clear and decisive. The property was legally mine, the HOA had no jurisdiction, and all fines, liens, and notices were null and void. On top of that, the HOA was ordered to pay damages for harassment and vandalism, enough to cover every repair, every sleepless night, and then some. When the gavel came down, I felt like I could finally breathe again. Months of tension melted away in an instant. People in the courtroom actually clapped, and a couple of the other property owners came up to shake my hand. It felt less like a legal victory and more like a community standing up to a bully and finally winning. Driving back to the cabin that night, I couldn't stop smiling. The air felt fresher, the lake seemed bluer, and for the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like home. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself back into renovations, but this time with peace of mind. No more signs, no more threats, no more late-night headlights creeping up the driveway. I replaced the slashed tires, repainted the truck, and even built a new porch where I could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset without constantly glancing over my shoulder. When the work was finally done, I invited a few friends up for a cookout to celebrate. We sat around a fire pit, grilled steaks, and laughed about everything that had happened. It felt good to laugh about it, like I had finally taken back not just my property, but my life. As the fire crackled and the stars came out, I looked around at the cabin, the lake, and the quiet stretch of woods that surrounded it. I thought about all the nights I'd sat here angry, worried, exhausted, wondering if I was doing the right thing by staying. And in that moment, I knew I had been right all along. This was worth fighting for. If there was one thing I had learned through the whole ordeal, it was that sometimes you have to stand your ground, literally, because if you don't, someone else will happily take what's yours. Now, every time I wake up at the cabin, I step out onto the porch with a cup of coffee and take a deep breath of that fresh pine-scented air. And every time, I remind myself, this is my land, my cabin, my sanctuary, and no HOA in the world is ever going to take it from me again.